The Frightened Encounter. On a sunny afternoon, the park was alive with laughter and joy. Children played on swings, their laughter filling the air, while others ran around, chasing each other. The bright sun painted everything in cheerful colors. Near the park entrance, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins sat on a wooden bench, happily knitting a bright blue scarf. She loved watching the children play, their energy reminding her of her own childhood. As Mrs. Jenkins worked, she noticed a little girl sitting alone under a tree. The girl, Lily, was about 6 years old, with curly brown hair and big bright eyes. Today, however, her eyes were filled with fear. Lily looked around nervously, her small hands gripping her doll tightly. Mrs. Jenkins felt a pang of concern in her heart. Suddenly, Lily jumped up and started running toward Mrs. Jenkins, her feet pounding against the grass. The elderly woman looked up, surprised by the girl's sudden movement. "Oh dear, what's wrong?" Mrs. Jenkins asked as Lily reached her, breathless and trembling. "Please, help me," Lily gasped, her voice shaking. "There's a man. He's scary." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, dear? What did you see?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm and soothing. "He was watching the other kids," Lily whispered urgently, glancing back again. "He had on a dark hoodie and sunglasses. He looked really mean. I thought he was going to do something bad." Mrs. Jenkins' heart raced. She could see the fear in Lily's eyes, and it made her own heart heavy with worry. "Did he come near you?" she asked gently, trying to gather more information. Lily shook her head. "No, but he was really close to my friend Sarah. I felt scared and ran away. I didn't want him to see me." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, trying to reassure the girl. "You did the right thing by running to me. It's important to stay safe." She placed a comforting hand on Lily's shoulder. "Can you show me where you saw this man?" Lily hesitated but nodded. "Okay, but be careful." Together, they walked slowly toward the area where Lily had seen the man. As they approached the playground, Mrs. Jenkins scanned the surroundings. She saw children playing, swinging, and laughing, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach. "Do you see him?" Mrs. Jenkins asked quietly, glancing down at Lily. Lily pointed to a spot under the large oak tree. "There. He was standing right there." Mrs. Jenkins squinted, trying to see if the man was still there. To her relief, he was gone. "I don't see him anymore, but let's stay alert," she said, keeping her voice low. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the park as a group of children tumbled over each other, laughing. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, momentarily distracted by their joy. But she quickly turned her attention back to Lily, who looked even more anxious. "Maybe he went home," Lily suggested, her voice hopeful yet uncertain. "Maybe," Mrs. Jenkins replied, though her instincts told her otherwise. She had heard stories of children going missing, and knew it was better to be safe than sorry. "Let's sit down for a moment, shall we? You can tell me more about what happened." They returned to the bench, and Mrs. Jenkins wrapped her arm around Lily. The girl leaned against her, seeking comfort. "I don't want to go back to the playground," Lily whispered. "I understand, sweetheart. How about we just stay here for a bit and keep an eye out?" Mrs. Jenkins suggested. As they sat, Mrs. Jenkins noticed how the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The park that had once felt so lively now seemed a bit more threatening. "If you see him again, just come straight to me, okay?" she said softly. Lily nodded, her grip on the doll tightening. "I promise," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Minutes passed, and they remained alert, watching the other children play. But Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. She felt a mix of worry for Lily and concern for the other children who were still unaware. "Maybe we should call someone," Mrs. Jenkins finally said, her voice firm. "It's important to make sure everyone is safe." Lily looked up at her, fear flashing across her face. "Call Lou." Maybe we should call the police, Mrs. Jenkins suggested, just to let them know about that man. They can help keep everyone safe. Lily's eyes widened. Will they come here? Yes, they will, Mrs. Jenkins reassured her, and they'll make sure that man doesn't come back. Lily seemed to consider this, her brows furrowing in thought. Okay, let's do it, she said, her voice gaining strength. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath. She didn't want to scare Lily further, but she knew they needed to act. She pulled out her phone, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. As she dialed, she glanced around the park, watching the happy faces of the children playing, knowing that she was about to take an important step to protect them all. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a terrifying encounter that would change their lives forever. The shocking secret. Mrs. Jenkins pressed the phone to her ear, her heart racing as she waited for someone to answer. The cheerful sounds of laughter and playing children surrounded her, but she felt a heavy weight in her chest. It was a beautiful day, yet the fear in Lily's eyes reminded her of the danger lurking nearby. After a few rings, a calm voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Hello, Mrs. Jenkins said, trying to sound steady. I'm in the park, and I need to report a suspicious man. A little girl saw him watching children. He had on a dark hoodie and sunglasses. Can you describe the man's behavior? The operator asked. He was standing by the playground, watching the kids closely. The little girl, Lily, felt scared. I'm not sure what he wanted, but it didn't seem right, Mrs. Jenkins explained, her voice shaking slightly. Okay, we're sending officers to your location. Please keep the girl close and do not confront the man if you see him again. Can you stay on the line? Yes, I can do that, Mrs. Jenkins replied, glancing down at Lily, who looked even more frightened now. The thought of the man returning sent shivers down her spine. Ma'am, can you tell me if you see the man right now? The operator continued. No, I don't see him at the moment, Mrs. Jenkins said, scanning the area. But I'm worried he might come back. Stay where you are. Officers will be there shortly. If you see the man, make sure to keep your distance, the operator instructed before ending the call. Mrs. Jenkins put her phone away and turned to Lily, who was now trembling slightly. The police are on their way, sweetie. They'll help keep everyone safe, she said, trying to sound reassuring. Lily nodded, but her eyes darted around the park, searching for any sign of danger. What if he comes back? She whispered, her voice trembling. We'll stay right here, and we'll be safe together, Mrs. Jenkins assured her. Just remember to tell me if you see him, okay? Lily clutched her doll tightly, the fabric of its dress crumpling in her small hands. The minutes felt like hours as they waited, each second stretching into a tense silence. The laughter from the other children felt distant, overshadowed by the fear creeping into their hearts. Suddenly, a movement caught Mrs. Jenkins' eye. She turned to see a man standing near the entrance of the park. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie and sunglasses, just as Lily had described. Her heart raced as she realized it was the same man Lily had seen earlier. There he is, Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed, her voice barely above a whisper. She squeezed Lily's shoulder gently. Stay close to me. Lily pressed against Mrs. Jenkins, her eyes wide with fear. The man seemed to be watching the playground, his gaze fixed on the children. Mrs. Jenkins felt a rush of panic. He was not just a suspicious figure. He was a direct threat to the safety of the children. Is he coming over here? Lily whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, trying to keep her expression calm. No, not yet. But let's be ready, just in case. She could feel her heartbeat thumping in her chest as she watched the man's movements closely. As they observed him, Mrs. Jenkins felt a surge of anger. How could someone be so careless as to threaten innocent children? She clenched her fists, knowing she had to protect Lily and the other kids in the park. Suddenly, the man started walking toward the playground. Mrs. Jenkins felt a rush of fear. Lily, we need to move. Let's go to the other side of the park where it's more crowded, she said urgently, standing up and gently pulling Lily with her. Okay. Lily agreed, her little legs moving quickly as they hurried away from the man. They weaved through the grass, keeping their eyes on the playground while trying to stay unnoticed. As they reached a more crowded area near the picnic tables, Mrs. Jenkins glanced back to see if the man had followed them. He was still near the playground, looking around. Mrs. Jenkins' heart sank. He was still watching the children. Just then, Mrs. Jenkins spotted a group of parents chatting nearby. She felt a little safer knowing there were more adults around. Let's sit here for a moment, she suggested, leading Lily to an empty table. They sat down, and Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. You did really well, Lily. I'm proud of you for telling me about the man, she said softly. Do you think the police will catch him? Lily asked, her eyes still scanning the area. I hope so, Mrs. Jenkins replied, glancing around. They'll take this seriously. We just need to stay alert until they arrive. A few minutes passed, and the tension in the air was thick. Mrs. Jenkins felt a sense of dread creeping in. What if the man got away? What if he was a real danger? She wished the police would arrive quickly. Just as she was about to say something to Lily, a siren echoed through the park. Both their heads turned towards the sound, relief washing over Mrs. Jenkins. That's them, she said, feeling hopeful. Lily's eyes brightened, and she clutched her doll tighter. Are they going to help us? Yes, they will, Mrs. Jenkins assured her. Everything will be all right now. As the police car pulled into the parking lot, Mrs. Jenkins felt a mix of fear and relief. She knew they were about to face a shocking truth, and she hoped the little girl's bravery would be enough to protect them all. The police arrived. The police car rolled into the park, its bright lights flashing against the trees. Mrs. Jenkins felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, help was here. She quickly stood up, holding Lily's hand tightly. Look, sweetie, the police are here, she said, trying to lift Lily's spirits. As the officers stepped out of the vehicle, Mrs. Jenkins waved her hand to get their attention. Two uniformed officers approached, one a tall man with a serious expression, and the other a woman with kind eyes. Good afternoon, ma'am, the male officer said, looking at Mrs. Jenkins. What seems to be the problem? There's a suspicious man over by the playground, Mrs. Jenkins explained, her voice steady but filled with urgency. A little girl came to me, scared, and said he was watching the kids. I saw him just moments ago. The female officer nodded, taking notes on her pad. Can you describe him for us? He's tall, wearing a dark hoodie and sunglasses, Mrs. Jenkins said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure the man was still nearby. He's over there. She pointed towards the playground, where the man had been standing. Stay here with the child, the male officer instructed. We'll check it out. As the officers walked towards the playground, Mrs. Jenkins turned to Lily. You did the right thing, honey. The police will take care of this, she said, trying to reassure the little girl. I hope they catch him, Lily replied, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Jenkins squeezed her hand. Me too. You're so brave. The officers approached the man, who seemed to be unaware of their presence at first. As they got closer, they began to ask him questions. Mrs. Jenkins watched anxiously, holding her breath. She could see the man's body language change. He suddenly looked nervous as the officers approached. What's your name? The male officer asked, standing confidently in front of the man. I'm just waiting for a friend, the man stammered, his eyes darting around. Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. His response sounded suspicious. Why was he watching children? Why did he seem so nervous? The female officer continued. We've had reports of someone acting suspiciously around here. Can we see some identification? The man hesitated, reaching into his pocket slowly. I don't have it on me right now, he said, his voice shaky. Why don't you come with us to the car? We can sort this out, the male officer said firmly. The man's expression shifted from nervousness to outright panic. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. I swear," he protested, stepping back. "Sir, you need to calm down," the female officer replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We just want to ask you some questions." Suddenly, the man turned and started to run away from the officers, bolting towards the park's exit. "Stop! Police!" the male officer shouted as they both chased after him. Mrs. Jenkins felt her heart race as she watched the scene unfold. "Lily, stay here. I'll be right back," she called out, her instincts kicking in. She knew she had to keep the little girl safe. "Okay," Lily shouted, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Jenkins hurried towards the direction where the officers had gone, trying to keep them in sight. The park was full of children playing, and she felt a mix of concern and determination. She wanted to help catch this man before he could disappear. As the officers chased the man, Mrs. Jenkins saw other parents and children staring, confused by the commotion. She reached the edge of the playground, where she could still see the chase unfolding. "Stop! Police!" the officers yelled again. The man dashed past the park entrance, heading toward the street. Mrs. Jenkins felt a surge of adrenaline. "Someone call the police again," she shouted to the nearby parents, who looked just as shocked. "He's getting away." As the officers ran after him, Mrs. Jenkins thought about what to do. She couldn't let him escape, not after all the fear he had caused. Suddenly, she remembered something important. "Lily," she called back, hoping the little girl would stay put. "Stay with the other kids and wait for me." Lily nodded, looking worried, but she stayed where Mrs. Jenkins had left her. With determination, Mrs. Jenkins ran along the path, trying to keep pace with the officers. The man was fast, but the officers were strong. She could hear their footsteps pounding against the ground as they chased after him. "Why are you running?" the female officer shouted. "We just want to talk." But the man didn't stop. Instead, he continued to sprint away, looking back at the officers, clearly panicking. Mrs. Jenkins' heart pounded. She couldn't let him get away. He had to be stopped. Finally, the man reached the edge of the street, and just as he was about to cross, a police car pulled up beside him. The officers shouted once more, "Stop!" The man skidded to a halt, realizing he was trapped. The two officers quickly closed in on him, and in an instant, they had him pinned against the side of the car. "Get your hands where we can see them," the male officer ordered. Mrs. Jenkins felt a rush of relief wash over her. They had caught him. She stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. This was not just about catching a suspicious man. It was about keeping children safe, including sweet Lily. As the officers searched him, Mrs. Jenkins felt a surge of gratitude. They were doing their job, protecting the innocent. She turned and walked back towards Lily, who was now standing with other concerned parents. "Lily, it's okay. They caught him," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice filled with relief. Lily's eyes widened. "Really? They did?" "Yes. You were so brave, and now you're safe," Mrs. Jenkins assured her, kneeling down to hug her tightly. The chaos began to settle, and Mrs. Jenkins felt a sense of calm wash over her. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions to be answered, and she hoped Lily's bravery would shine through in the story they would tell. The truth comes out. The park was finally quiet, but the tension lingered in the air. Mrs. Jenkins held Lily close as they watched the officers continue their work. A crowd of parents and curious onlookers had gathered, whispering among themselves. Everyone wanted to know what had happened and why a little girl had felt so frightened. As the officers led the suspicious man to the police car, Mrs. Jenkins noticed a small group of children peering from behind the playground equipment, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. She felt a responsibility to reassure them. "It's okay, everyone. The police have caught the man who scared Lily," she called out. "You're all safe now." The children slowly approached, their faces softening as they heard her words. They exchanged glances, feeling the comfort of safety slowly returning to the park. Lily pulled away from Mrs. Jenkins and approached one of her friends. "I was really scared," she admitted. "I thought he was going to take me." Her friend's eyes widened. "Me too. I saw him looking at you from the swings," she said. Meanwhile, the officers were speaking with the man in the police car. They were asking questions, trying to understand his story. Mrs. Jenkins felt an urge to learn what had happened, so she stepped closer to the police. "Excuse me," she said, catching the attention of the female officer. "What's going to happen now? Why was that man acting so strangely?" The officer looked at Mrs. Jenkins, her face calm yet serious. "We're trying to figure that out. He's being taken in for questioning. We have to ensure that there's no real threat to the children in the area." Just then, another police car arrived, and a detective stepped out. He was taller than the officers and looked more serious. He walked straight towards them, clipboard in hand. "Detective Johnson, can you tell us what's going on?" the female officer asked, glancing at the man in the car. Detective Johnson nodded, flipping through his notes. "We've had several reports about a man fitting his description, lurking around schools and playgrounds. It's crucial that we get to the bottom of this quickly." Mrs. Jenkins felt a knot form in her stomach. What was he doing? Was he hurting children? "We don't know yet," Detective Johnson replied, keeping his tone professional. "But it's important for parents to stay alert and to report any suspicious behavior. Can you tell us exactly what happened here?" Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, recalling the moment Lily had approached her. "I was sitting on the bench when Lily came running over. She looked terrified and told me that a man had been watching her. I didn't see what he was doing, but I knew it wasn't right." Detective Johnson scribbled down notes. "What did she say about him?" Mrs. Jenkins glanced at Lily, who was listening closely. "She said he was staring at her from the swings, and it made her feel really scared." The detective nodded. "That's important information. We'll need to talk to her too, if she's comfortable. Lily, would you like to talk to the nice detective?" Mrs. Jenkins asked gently. Lily looked up, her small voice trembling slightly. "Can I tell him what I saw?" "Of course, sweetheart," Mrs. Jenkins encouraged her. "You're very brave for sharing." With a small nod, Lily walked over to Detective Johnson, her little hands clasped nervously. "I saw him watching me. He looked really strange," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Lily," Detective Johnson said, kneeling down to her level. "You did the right thing by telling your mom and getting help. Can you remember anything else about the man? What he looked like, or what he was doing?" Lily thought for a moment. "He had a hood on, and he was standing really still. It made me feel scared," she explained, her big eyes wide. Detective Johnson listened carefully, making notes. "You were very brave, and your mom is proud of you. If you remember anything else, you can always tell someone." "Okay." "Okay," Lily replied, feeling a little bit more confident. As the officers continued their investigation, Mrs. Jenkins felt a wave of pride for her daughter. She was proud of Lily for being brave enough to speak up, but she also felt a lingering worry about what might have happened if Lily hadn't found her. Just then, one of the other parents approached. It was a woman named Mrs. Smith, who had a daughter in the same class as Lily. "What happened here?" she asked, looking concerned. "A man was acting suspiciously, and Lily saw him watching her," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "The police are taking care of it now." Mrs. Smith's expression turned serious. "That's terrifying. I'm glad the police got involved. We need to keep our kids safe." Mrs. Jenkins nodded in agreement. "It's a scary world out there. I just hope they can figure out what he was doing." As the officers finished their questioning, Mrs. Jenkins caught sight of the man in the police car. He was no longer hiding his fear. He looked panicked and desperate. She wondered what he was thinking and what had led him to act this way. Suddenly, the detective turned to the gathered crowd. We want to assure you all that your children are safe. Please remain vigilant and report anything strange to the authorities. We'll keep you updated as we learn more." Mrs. Jenkins felt a sense of relief wash over her. The police were taking the situation seriously, and she could finally breathe a little easier. But deep down, she knew this story wasn't over. There were still many questions to be answered, and she hoped they would uncover the truth behind the man's behavior soon. As she watched Lily play with her friends, Mrs. Jenkins realized how important it was for parents to talk to their children about safety. They needed to be aware of their surroundings and trust their instincts. The world could be a scary place, but together, they could keep each other safe. A community unites. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park. Families started to pack up their things, but the air still buzzed with concern about what had happened. Mrs. Jenkins watched as Lily laughed and played with her friends, her smile bright against the backdrop of worry that hung over the park. "Are you okay, Mrs. Jenkins?" Mrs. Smith asked as she approached with her daughter in tow. That was a scary situation. "Yes, it was," Mrs. Jenkins replied, her heart still racing. "But I'm just glad Lily is safe." She looked at her daughter, who seemed to have forgotten the events of the day and was fully engaged in her games. "I can't believe someone would do that," Mrs. Smith said, shaking her head. "We need to make sure our kids know what to do in these situations." Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "Absolutely. I plan to talk to Lily tonight about staying safe and what to do if someone makes her uncomfortable. It's important for all of us to have that conversation." As more parents gathered, the conversation shifted to safety measures. A father named Mr. Rodriguez suggested they organize a neighborhood watch group. "If we're all aware of what's happening, we can help keep our children safe," he said, his voice filled with determination. "That's a great idea." Another parent chimed in. "We can set up a group chat to share information and alerts." Mrs. Jenkins felt a spark of hope. The idea of a community coming together to protect their children felt empowering. "I'm in," she said. "We should all work together." As the parents discussed logistics, Lily ran up to her mom, breathless from playing. "Can I have a sleepover with Sarah this weekend?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Sure, honey. But I want to talk to you first about something important," Mrs. Jenkins replied, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "I want to make sure you feel safe, especially after today." Lily nodded, understanding her mom's concern. "I will, Mom. I promise," she said, squeezing her mother's hand. "Good," Mrs. Jenkins replied with a smile. "And remember, if anything ever makes you uncomfortable, you can always come to me or another trusted adult." Just then, the detective approached them again, a serious expression on his face. "Mrs. Jenkins, may I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," she replied, feeling a sudden knot in her stomach. She hoped the news was good. Once they were away from the crowd, Detective Johnson said, "I wanted to thank you for your help today. You and Lily acted quickly, and that made a difference. We're investigating the man further, and we believe there are other reports of similar behavior in different parks around the area." Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. "So he's done this before?" "Yes, it appears so," the detective replied. "We're doing everything we can to ensure he doesn't pose a threat to anyone. We might need your assistance later if we decide to press charges." "I understand," Mrs. Jenkins said, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "Just let me know what you need." As they returned to the gathering, the detective continued, "And please keep spreading the word about safety measures. The more people are aware, the better we can protect our kids." Mrs. Jenkins looked around at her neighbors, their faces etched with concern, but also determination. She could see the shared commitment to safety. "We're planning to start a neighborhood watch," she announced. "It'll help us all keep an eye on our kids and each other." "Great idea," a voice from the crowd called out. "Let's do it." As the discussion grew more energetic, Mrs. Jenkins felt a sense of community pride swelling inside her. They were taking action, and together they could make a difference. Later that evening, as Mrs. Jenkins tucked Lily into bed, she took a moment to reflect on the day's events. "You were very brave today, sweetheart," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. Lily smiled, but her expression was serious. "I was really scared, Mom. But I knew I had to run to you." "That's exactly what you should do," Mrs. Jenkins replied, feeling warmth in her heart. "Always trust your instincts. And remember, you are never alone. We are a community, and we all look out for each other." Lily nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Lily," she said softly, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Always." As Mrs. Jenkins walked out of Lily's room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would do everything she could to ensure Lily and the other children were safe. The park may have felt frightening that day, but it also showed her the strength of their community. They would unite and protect each other, no matter what. Little did they know that the events of that day would lead to greater challenges ahead, but for now, they were a strong and connected community, ready to face whatever came next. The investigation deepens. The following days passed quickly, but the events at the park lingered in everyone's minds. Mrs. Jenkins and the other parents were committed to their newfound mission of safety. They organized meetings in their community center, where they discussed strategies to keep their children safe. But while they focused on their local plans, the investigation into the man who had frightened Lily continued to unfold. Detective Johnson kept the community informed, sending updates through their newly formed neighborhood watch group chat. "We've received additional reports of suspicious behavior," he wrote one evening. "We believe the man may be trying to blend in, so please stay vigilant." Mrs. Jenkins read the message with a frown. The fear that had gripped her heart at the park began to resurface. How could they protect their children from someone who seemed to slip through the cracks? At the next community meeting, held in the warm glow of the community center, parents gathered to discuss the latest developments. The room buzzed with tension as everyone awaited Detective Johnson's arrival. When he walked in, the chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Thank you for coming, everyone," he began, his voice steady. "I know you all have been worried about your children, and rightfully so. I'm here to share some updates on the investigation and discuss how we can work together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Mrs. Jenkins sat up straighter, eager to hear what the detective had to say. "First, we have a description of the suspect," Detective Johnson continued. "He is a white male, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a beard. We're urging everyone to keep an eye out for anyone matching this description, especially if they seem out of place in the parks or around schools." The room filled with whispers as parents exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Jenkins felt her heart race. "What if he comes back?" she thought. Detective Johnson raised a hand for silence. "I also want to emphasize the importance of communication. If you see something suspicious or have any concerns, don't hesitate to call 911. And remember to talk to your children about how to stay safe and what to do if they feel threatened." After the meeting, Mrs. Jenkins stayed behind to speak with the detective. "What more can we do to help?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. "Your community watch is a great start," Detective Johnson replied. "But I also recommend that you consider organizing a safety day. We could invite local law enforcement to give demonstrations on self-defense and safety tips for kids." "I love that idea," Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed. "We can teach the kids how to respond if they ever feel scared. They need to know how to protect themselves." "Yes, and it will empower them," the detective added, a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "I'll help you set it up. We can make it a fun event that encourages awareness and community spirit." Excited, Mrs. Jenkins hurried home to share the news with Lily. As she walked through the front door, she found her daughter drawing at the kitchen table. "Guess what, Lily?" Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "We're planning a safety day with the police." Lily looked up, curious. "What's a safety day?" "It's going to be a day where we learn how to stay safe and what to do in scary situations. Mrs. Jenkins explained. There will be fun activities, and the police will show us some cool safety tips. Lily's eyes widened. Can I go? Will my friends be there? Yes, of course. Mrs. Jenkins replied, her heart swelling with pride. We want all the kids to come. It will be a great way to help everyone feel safer. As the days passed, Mrs. Jenkins and the other parents worked tirelessly to prepare for the safety day. They handed out flyers, made posters, and spread the word through social media. The excitement in the community was palpable, and Mrs. Jenkins felt a growing sense of unity among the parents. Finally, the day of the event arrived. The sun shone brightly, and the park was filled with laughter and chatter as families gathered. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, announcing the Community Safety Day. Booths were set up with games, safety demonstrations, and informational pamphlets. Detective Johnson arrived with a team of officers, ready to engage with the kids and teach them valuable lessons. As they demonstrated safety techniques, Mrs. Jenkins watched, her heart full. She could see how engaged the children were, learning to shout for help, practice escape routes, and even a few basic self-defense moves. At one booth, Lily and her friends took turns practicing how to call 911. What's your emergency? Lily said into the pretend phone, her expression serious. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, knowing that these lessons would stick with them. As the day progressed, Detective Johnson gathered everyone for a closing speech. I want to thank all of you for coming out today and taking the time to learn about safety, he said, his voice carrying over the excited crowd. Remember, it takes all of us to keep our community safe. Stay alert, communicate with each other, and don't hesitate to reach out if you see something suspicious. A loud cheer erupted from the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins felt a surge of pride wash over her. They were united in their mission to protect their children, and together they would stand strong against any threats. As families began to pack up their belongings and head home, Mrs. Jenkins took Lily's hand, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. They had taken action, made a difference, and most importantly, they had created a supportive community where everyone looked out for one another. But little did they know, the investigation was far from over, and challenges lay ahead that would test their strength and resolve. The final confrontation. In the weeks following the successful safety day, the atmosphere in the community remained charged with concern and determination. Mrs. Jenkins and the other parents stayed vigilant, often sharing tips and updates in their neighborhood group chat. However, as days turned into weeks, the sense of urgency seemed to wane. Many began to hope that the man who had frightened Lily would simply disappear, but Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of him. One afternoon, as she was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed with a message from Detective Johnson. We have a lead on the suspect. He was spotted near the school earlier today. I will be in the area, so please stay alert and keep your kids close. Mrs. Jenkins' heart raced. She quickly called Lily, who was playing with her friends outside. Lily, sweetie, it's time to come inside, she urged, trying to keep her voice calm. Why, Mom? We're having fun. Lily protested, glancing back at her friends. There's a situation with the police, Mrs. Jenkins replied, her eyes scanning the street. I just want you to be safe. Please come inside now. Reluctantly, Lily obeyed. As they settled into the living room, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and resolve. They had to stay vigilant, but they also needed to prepare for what might come next. Later that evening, as Mrs. Jenkins was cleaning up after dinner, she heard a knock on the door. It was Detective Johnson, his expression serious. I need to talk to you, he said, stepping inside. Is everything okay? Mrs. Jenkins asked, her heart pounding. We received a tip about the man, he explained, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was listening. He has been seen near the park, but we believe he may be trying to make contact with kids again. We're ramping up patrols in the area, but we need your help. Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. What do you need us to do? We want you and the other parents to keep an eye out. If you see anything suspicious, do not confront him. Just call 911 immediately and make sure the kids are aware of their surroundings. We want them to feel safe, but they need to know what to do if they see him. Absolutely, Mrs. Jenkins agreed. We'll do whatever it takes to keep our kids safe. The next morning, the community buzzed with whispers of the potential danger. Parents were on high alert, and the children were reminded of the safety tips they learned during the safety day. Lily, although anxious, felt a sense of empowerment knowing she could help keep herself safe. That afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins decided to take Lily to the park. She believed that confronting their fears was important, and the park was still a beloved place for the children. As they walked, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She scanned the area, her eyes darting between the trees and benches. Lily played with her friends, but Mrs. Jenkins remained vigilant, often glancing at the path that led to the park entrance. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure standing by the trees. Her heart raced as she recognized the man from the police sketch. He was tall, with dark hair and a beard, just as Detective Johnson had described. Lily, she called out, her voice firm yet calm. Come here, sweetie. Lily turned and ran to her mother's side. What's wrong, Mom? Just stay close to me, Mrs. Jenkins replied, her heart pounding. She pulled out her phone and discreetly dialed 911, her hands shaking slightly as she kept her eyes on the man. 911. What's your emergency? The operator answered. There's a man in the park who looks suspicious. I think he's the one we've been warned about. I'm at the entrance by the swings, she whispered, trying to remain calm. Stay on the line and keep your distance. Officers are on their way, the operator instructed. Mrs. Jenkins hung up and kept her gaze fixed on the man, who seemed to be watching the children play. She felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. How dare he come back here? Suddenly, the man turned and began walking away, disappearing down the path. Mrs. Jenkins' instincts kicked in. Lily, stay here with your friends, she instructed, her voice steady. Mom, where are you going? Lily asked, her eyes wide with worry. I'm going to see where he goes. Stay put and don't move, Mrs. Jenkins replied, keeping her voice firm. She followed the man, her heart racing. She had to know where he was going, and she had to ensure he didn't come back. As she walked, she maintained a safe distance, her eyes locked on his back. Suddenly, the man turned into a nearby alley. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, feeling fear grip her. But she had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She continued down the alley, her heart pounding. Then she heard voices ahead. Peeking around the corner, she saw the man talking to someone else, a woman. They seemed to be arguing, and the woman looked frightened. Mrs. Jenkins' instincts kicked in. She couldn't just stand by. Hey, she shouted, stepping into view. What's going on? The man turned, surprised to see her. Mind your own business, he snapped, his tone harsh. No, this is my business. Leave her alone, Mrs. Jenkins declared, her voice shaking but firm. The woman glanced at Mrs. Jenkins, her eyes wide with gratitude. Please, help me, she cried. Just then, sirens blared in the distance, growing louder. The man's expression shifted from surprise to anger. You should have stayed away, he growled, starting to move toward Mrs. Jenkins. But before he could reach her, police officers flooded into the alley. Stop right there, one shouted, and the man froze, his face a mix of fear and frustration. Officers, he's the one. Mrs. Jenkins pointed, her voice steady now. He's been scaring children in the park. The officers quickly surrounded the man, who now looked cornered. You're under arrest, one officer said, cuffing him. As the tension lifted, Mrs. Jenkins felt a rush of relief. The danger was finally over. The officers took control, and soon the woman was being comforted and questioned. Mrs. Jenkins stood nearby, her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold. Detective Johnson arrived moments later, his eyes scanning the area before landing on Mrs. Jenkins. "You did great," he said, pride evident in his voice. "You really helped us catch him." Mrs. Jenkins smiled, tears of relief filling her eyes. "I just wanted to protect the kids." "You've done more than that," he replied. "You showed everyone that standing together makes a difference." As the sun set on the park, casting a warm glow over the scene, Mrs. Jenkins held Lily tightly, feeling grateful for their safety and the strength of their community. They had faced a significant challenge and emerged stronger. Though they knew the road ahead would not always be easy, they had learned the importance of vigilance, support, and courage. And as they walked home, hand in hand, Mrs. Jenkins knew that they would continue to look out for one another, creating a brighter, safer future for all their children.